Good afternoon. I'm Andrew Wotton, one of the directors of ProtectED, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to another ProtectED Reflections event. Today's event is entitled Beyond Sexual Misconduct, University Mishandling and Student Misery, Protecting the Student Experience. Thank you for joining us for today's session, which, as with previous ProtectED Reflections events, is being recorded. Please do open your chat window and quickly introduce yourselves to each other so that everyone behind their screens can know a little bit more about who's attending today. There will be an opportunity for you to put your questions to our panel at the end of the webinar, so please make use of the Q&A feature in Zoom. You should see a Q&A button in the black bar at the top or bottom of your window, depending on how you have Zoom configured. Please type any questions you'd like to ask into the Q&A window, and I will put these to our speakers towards the end of today's session. So I am pleased to welcome Professor Caroline Davey, one of my fellow ProtectED directors, and we're delighted that Caroline will be moderating a discussion with a panel of 4 guests this afternoon. Dr. Anna Bull, who is a founding member of the 1752 group and a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Portsmouth. Georgina Calvert-Lee, who is a practicing barrister and head of UK practice and senior counsel at the transatlantic law firm McAllister Olivarius. Georgina is also a member of the ProtectED Advisory Board. Georgina collaborated with Anna and the 1752 group on the provision of detailed recommendations last year in their publication Sector Guidance to Address Staff Sexual Misconduct in UK Higher Education. And we welcome Nikki and Josie Hart, co-founders of Reclaim the Campus, a student and survivor-led campaign around issues of sexual harassment and violence in higher education. Nikki and Josie are co-authors of the Reclaim Report, an analysis of UK universities' sexual misconduct policies, which was published last month. Good afternoon to you all, and over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Andrew. So Anna, Georgina, Nikki and Josie, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. So first of all, I've got a question for all of you. Over the past decade, we've had numerous reports either revealing poor practice or providing recommendations and guidance on good practice. Yet the problem persists of universities not putting into practice preventative action, not supporting incident reporting, not dealing appropriately with incidents of sexual misconduct, and not supporting victims and survivors. And I'd like to ask you, why do you think universities and the HE sector in general has been slow to change? Is it to do with the way institutions are managed, how they're structured? Is it a cultural issue? What do you think is going on? And I'll turn first to Anna, if I may.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Yeah, important question to start with. I think it's, seeing everybody who's turned up in the chat, it's important to recognise that, universities are starting to invest in specialist roles and specialist staff to address this area. But I think the main thing that's going on is just simply not prioritising sexual and gender-based violence sufficiently, and perhaps not realising the scale of the shift that is needed. This is really an historic shift. We're moving on from second wave feminism in the 70s, where sexual and gender-based violence was really put on the agenda. It's not until now that kind of institutions in society, including universities and other education institutions, are really, in the UK anyway, having to grapple with the scale of what it would take to really seriously grapple with preventing and responding to the scale of sexual violence that we see. So I think we've got to get senior leaders to recognise the extent of the shift that's required, and prioritise this. And this requires a level of care for students and staff that, let's say, isn't incentivised in a kind of marketised higher education system. And also we're not seeing regulation from central government stepping up to fill that gap either.
Thank you. Nikki or Josie, would you like to add something?
I don't mind unless Josie would want to take this one. But yeah, my notes say quite similar things to Anna. When we were looking at analysis we did for the report, like they do change by institution. So there's not really consistency and like outward pressure. It's like, what is an individual, organization, or university doing? Whereas if there was more outward influence compelling them to have these standards, then that would address at least one part. Again, like culture, we've looked a lot into culture change, especially since recently we've experienced this culture. And it's definitely something which it's important to acknowledge. And there's issues with cultures like rape culture, but it's actually a lot more complicated to influence and change culture, but you need to at least make that attempt. And yeah, a lot of things on, I think we can see like the wider normalization around sexual violence in society generally, that even as a student, you may just see like experiencing it as something which might happen and you might come up against. And I think there is generally this understanding that harassment in a lot of society or assault is just something which happens on various levels, as opposed to something which shouldn't be happening at all because it is so widespread. So there's definitely a parallel between these wider issues and then how we see them at universities, but there's still a large place for universities to play in addressing them on their campuses.
Thank you. And Georgina, do you have a view on why things are so slow to change?
Yes, I think I echo what Anna and Nikki have already said. I mean, as if as a society we are not addressing problems with sexual violence and discrimination adequately, then why would universities? But there is this other point that universities are, well, they're made up of lots of different individuals, and it's human nature not to do something if you don't have to do it, especially if it means getting a lot of people lined up. I mean, whose job is it going to be? Who's going to get all the relevant stakeholders on board? And everyone knows in their current jobs, they have a full plate of tasks. So it is a question of ensuring that the task of providing proper procedures or a whole slew of different things that will make the culture better, including better internal policies for how to address it after it's happened. That takes a bit of work, and it's got to be on someone's to-do list. And I think, in my experience, and I'm as guilty as the next person of this, you don't really do something until you absolutely have a deadline to do it, and you have to do it. And so I think it's all very well having dear colleague letters put out, and the Office for Students exhorting people to live up to good expectations, and I'm sure you'll all do it because we all want to have a better culture. That's not good enough. People will only do it if they're told you have to do it. Here is some mandatory guidance, which is easy to follow. You just need to follow it. And if you don't, you're going to face sanctions, fines, sort of lack of funding. Funding could be withheld. I think there has to be a mandatory system in place, regulation in place, with sanctions and penalties if it's not complied with.
Thank you. So you're all authors of recent reports addressing the issue of sexual misconduct in the university sector. And Georgina, I'd like to carry on with you. Last year, working with Anna at the 1752 group, McAllister Olivares published your excellent report providing guidance on how universities should be dealing with incidents of sexual misconduct. Please, could you tell us a little bit about your report and the response that you've received to it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that does follow on from the previous question. In our experience, there are many well-meaning people who are trying to do a good thing on an individual basis within organizations. But unless a whole organization has bought into it, that's not really good enough. And so we felt that there was a vacuum within the sector as to specific concrete guidance as to what people should do to follow a fair procedure. And it really flowed out of recognizing that there are common failings across universities throughout the sector as to how complaints of sexual misconduct are handled. And generally it flows from ignoring some basic principles. And the most basic principle that I think is pretty uncontroversial is that if you have a process for determining facts and whether something happened or not, you have to accord both individuals in that process, both the person who has complained about something and the person who is responding to that, who has been accused. You have to accord them both the same rights within that process, both to see evidence put against them, because even a complainant will face evidence being put against, usually her, could be him, but put against the complainant to undermine their credibility. And so there's evidence flowing on both sides. And currently the complainant has no access to any evidence shown against her, has no right to attend the hearing, has no right to see the outcome, has no right to appeal the outcome. And although in some individual universities, they're allowed to see bits of this, they don't currently, under the procedures, have any rights to see it. And so we felt, look, there's a real vacuum. We need to show universities what they need to do. And so that was the basis behind the guidance, and the guidance seeks to set out some clear principles and concrete measures that universities should take to make a better process.
Anna, can I ask you, you're obviously close to the universities, and I'd like to ask how has being involved in this report impacted on you and the 1752 group, and what has been the response to the report that you've seen?
Yeah, so I mean, working on this report, I mean, it's obviously a great privilege to work with Georgina on this, and you know, I learned a huge amount from working with her, and we were able to bring together research evidence from my research and our research as a group, and legal expertise. So that kind of you know, victim survivors' voices through our research evidence. So that was I think a really successful way of doing this. And this is really a continuation of the work we've been doing in the 72 group for, you know, it's been 5 years now since we set up. We thought we would have solved the problem by now. So feedback from the sector has been that they really appreciate having very detailed guidance, you know, step-by-step guidance. You know, we've got kind of sector level guidance such as the OFS at just very high level, and actually people need practical ways to implement this. We do know that institutions are starting to try and follow this. So the Royal Academy of Music have publicly stated they are going to follow this guidance after recent issues that they've been addressing in this area. There is a bit of an issue in that GDPR is making institutions nervous. Now, absolutely shouldn't. We have had discussions with the Information Commissioner's Office, and Universities UK are continuing those discussions. But I think that because changing practice in the university sector kind of works a bit like dominoes. Sorry, that's my cat. Universities say, oh, we won't do this until somebody else does. So even though something you know, is perfectly within the law, it takes that kind of courageous institution to say, yes, we have the confidence that this is the right thing to do, that we want to, you know, give parity to complainants and reporting parties. And so we want to take these steps. So there are a couple of institutions, there are several institutions that are taking these steps. So, you know, Durham and UCL are, as far as I understand, sharing outcomes for students. But this is an area where we really need some guidance, some statutory guidance that gives institutions the confidence to do the right thing, which we know they want to do.
Did you want to add anything to that, Georgina, regarding the GDPR issues that Anna raised?
Yes, I mean, GDPR is, it comes up in any question you ask about universities and the problems that they face or the reasons. I mean, I could have raised GDPR in relation to the first question, actually, that it's a piece of legislation which is, the fundamentals are good to protect people's data, but it's had the effect of prioritizing privacy rights over every other right, it seems to me, including the Human Rights Act and rights that accrue to everyone under the Equality Act. And so, you know, maybe later in the conversation we'll have more time to go into it. But for sure, the Data Protection Act is a real problem, not in itself, but in the fact that it's been given such, there are so many sanctions. There are real sanctions for breaching the DPA. Organizations can be fined. And that proves my point in a sense that something will only be prioritized once there is a sanction if you don't prioritize it. And that sanction's been put in place for data protection, but it hasn't been put in place for anything else. So of course, universities react, and every employer reacts by prioritizing that over other considerations. And so we actually need to bring up the Equality Act and Human Rights Act and put it on a level playing field, as it were, with the Data Protection Act. And then I think universities will be much safer. The ICO has it within their power to issue guidance to protect all organisations and explain how to balance the DPA against other rights, but it just hasn't done that yet.
I mean, do you think that GDPR is actually used as an excuse not to do something, not to take action?
Yes, I do, but I also recognise that it does impose some very real requirements on universities and any organisation. But what it doesn't do is say that these requirements trump everything else. And I think up until now, and continuing now, until there is special guidance from the ICO or whoever the ICO delegates it to, the UUK, until there's proper guidance out there which explains exactly the importance of balancing other rights like human rights and Equality Act rights, then the data protection is going to trump everything.
Thank you. So could I move to Josie or Nikki? You've recently published Reclaim the Campus, your report, analysing UK universities' sexual misconduct policies and encouraging institutions to improve practice. Could you tell us a little bit about your report? And also, I know it's very recent, your report, but what response have you had so far to it?
Yeah, so we started our campaign looking into a few universities' sexual misconduct policies to get a picture of what was going on there, because obviously our perspective is what we've experienced as students. So we wanted to understand what was happening in policy. And it became quite apparent that sexual misconduct wasn't being focused on specifically in policy at enough institutions. So we put together the report because we believe that if universities are going to start reforming policies and seeing what they could do better in their policy, student voices and student experience should be at the heart of that. So essentially, our report provides universities with that student perspective on what they could be doing better in their policy. So we went through 41 universities as a sample of UK universities and analysed each one's policy under a few categories. And then we've presented that in the report under our analysis of their policy on consent, on the support resources they're providing, on reporting procedures and different aspects like that. So we come to some recommendations that we've put under prevent, support and report. Essentially, some of our key recommendations are that all universities should have a specific policy on sexual misconduct that has a clear definition on sexual misconduct, and support resources and procedures should all be clear. So essentially, we agree that universities should be being held to a standard, and our report kind of gives that analysis of the standard that they should be held to from a student perspective. The response so far, we had obviously really good attendance at the launch event, and we have had lots of requests for the report from various people. We haven't yet been able to implement it at any universities, but obviously it is early days, so that is our hope.
It is early days, and we've got a link in the chat to the report for those that would like to download it. Okay, I'm going to move to Anna now, and what I'd like to ask is, do the recommendations and good practice around staff sexual misconduct carry over to the area of student sexual misconduct? So harassment and assault of one student by another. Do you see these different forms of sexual misconduct in higher education as distinctly different? So should institutions deal with them in different ways?
So overall, if you're going to improve your practice in one area, student to student, then your practice in the other area, or staff to student, is definitely also going to improve. They're absolutely related. And the key thing is to involve specialist expertise around sexual violence and gender-based violence in this process. There are differences. Of course, the student complaints system is set up differently. Sorry, that's my cat. I'm just going to go out of the way. She's being a real pain in the neck today. You'd be good. And the staff to student sexual misconduct will go through HR, so there will be different There'll be different ways of dealing with this. And I think it's also really important to think about the power balance between staff and students. So we know that people, regardless of who the perpetrator is, are unlikely to report. The vast majority of people will not report or even tell anybody or disclose what has happened to them. But when it comes to staff as perpetrators, we think that effect is actually exacerbated. Students can be absolutely terrified of disclosing any issues, relating to staff, and sometimes rightly so, because they do risk being victimized and being retaliated against. But of course, all of these things are also a risk in student sexual violence. So basically, to cut a long story short, overall, there are more similarities than differences, but the differences do need to be kept in mind.
Yeah, so particularly in terms of reporting, then there's a difference between whether the perpetrators are another student or a member of staff. Can I ask you, Georgina, what you think? Because obviously you're dealing with claimants at a different part of the process. So do you see big differences or do you see more similarities?
When people come to us because they feel let down by the way the university has handled their complaint, which is usually the thing that precipitates them to come to my door, actually, whether they are students or whether they are staff members, and whether they have been, their perpetrator is a staff member or a student, the same problems arise. It seems to be very consistent that if there is a bad process, I think this is actually exactly what Anna said, if there is, well, from the flip side, if there's a bad process in place for student-on-student complaints handling, there's likely to be similar failings with staff-on-student complaint handling, because what needs to be changed and what needs to be acknowledged is that there are two parties in this process, and they both need to be dealt with and given the same protections, dealt with equally, given the same protections. And so there's common failings happen across the board. But there are other issues in relation to staff-student sexual misconduct, which don't arise so much in student-on-student sexual violence. And one big difference we notice is the use of NDAs in settlements for staff members, because staff, of course, are employees. The university will be responsible if they have sexually harassed or assaulted a student or another staff member for that matter. And so if there's good evidence that that has happened, universities will sometimes respond by thinking, we need to make the place safe, let's get rid of this perpetrator, because perpetrators often do it again and again if they're not stopped. And so you may think, well, okay, that's good, they're protecting their students. But what they're doing is, what they'll say in America is they're passing the trash, or they're allowing someone who has not been properly disciplined in one environment to go on to another, where the new environment may not be aware of previous complaints. And so you're exposing another set of students, not your own students, but another university's students to risk. And so when universities want to get rid of someone that they think has actually perpetrated sexual misconduct, they will often sign a settlement agreement with that person because they're an employee. They may complain about losing their job otherwise. They'll sign a settlement agreement with an NDA, and that really hushes everything up so that the new university does not realize that there is this history of complaint. That doesn't happen with student-on-student misconduct so much, because universities they feel in a sense more even-handed in that these are both customers and they just want to sort of keep them both happy to the extent they can. But by keeping them both happy, if one is a rapist and one is a rape victim, just keeping them both happy by not doing anything is actually having a disproportionately bad effect on the victim, because they deserve something to happen. So with student-on-student harassment, we see confidentiality misused, but in a different way. Often the victim will want no contact, will want to have some agreement in place where they're not going to bump into their aggressor, say going to the dining hall, going to the lecture hall. And universities will sometimes take this on board and say, okay, we'll keep you both apart. But they will make a condition of a no contact agreement be that the student victim agrees to confidentiality, agrees to not mention the assault or the harassment to anyone else, which often leads to tremendous harms and a much greater exacerbation of the original harm. And that's something that I think universities need to stop doing. But that's something they do in the student-on-student misconduct scenario.
And can I ask, Georgina, is there a difference in terms of getting evidence against a perpetrator? Does it make a difference whether the perpetrator is a member of staff or a student?
It's sometimes a practical matter. I mean, the member of staff will have a lot more power in the institution, and so will be able to call upon character witness evidence much more easily than the student. They'll get a bunch of their other quite high-powered professors often to give them good character statements, and so that's evidence for the professor that the student won't necessarily have. Formally, there shouldn't be that much difference, but I think it's just the power imbalance does make it more difficult for a student to gather evidence.
Thank you. I'll turn to Nikki and Josie. From your experience of working with survivors, do you see a difference of whether the perpetrator was another student or a member of staff?
Yeah, this is something we looked previously into when we were looking into different issues. We didn't want to just take a really narrow approach, right? It would just be a student on student issue, even though that's something we were more aware of. In terms of differences, things which initially come to mind is friends or peers who did courses where it wasn't necessarily just a risk of university staff, but like when you do a placement-based course, maybe a medical student is an example which comes to mind from conversations I've had with friends, and perhaps the issue is coming from like a doctor, someone you conduct, like who is also having a power position, but wherever you're conducting your placement. So that is another issue to take into consideration. In terms of, what did you ask in terms of?
No, it's just generally whether you felt that there was a difference. So, but perhaps I can stay with you, Nikki, because I wanted to ask you, in terms of the Reclaim the Campus report, you mentioned the need for improved training around sexual consent for students. And I think you talk about training being compulsory, and that's a means for institutional culture change. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this issue.
Yeah, I think in terms of that issue, I guess how I personally see it is like universities are places for education, and that is a form of education. A lot of the emphasis, we're told, like ahead of enrolling into a university or while you're there, is how well it will prepare you for the world of work, or how well it will prepare you for the world outside of university. I think it's important to make sure, especially since the level of education we get around consent education and healthy relationships education can differ so dramatically. So for instance, I feel like I've had a lot more education on this than my friends due to the sort of school I've been to, but that's not a standard thing. By the time you are 17, 18 and attending university, not everyone has had the same level of education, and that is a comment on this problem is starting a lot earlier, even though we're seeing it manifested in these places, and also with other prominent things going on right now, such as Everyone's Invited and other organizations. I believe Bold Voices is one of them. There is stuff happening before it gets to the university level, and this I just see as another attempt which can be in place to intercept that, and especially to do with some of the other cultural suggestions you have at university. So things like how you relate to your peers. There's a large drinking culture at university as well, which I do believe some institutions can almost benefit from. There's a large emphasis on student experience. Personally, I can say my university emphasized student experience a lot, and I believe this is also to do with it. I think to get a comprehensive education on consent is important. I think as well, understanding how to respect your peers in several different ways, including when it comes to their bodies and how you act around them, is also important. So that's why we're supportive that for some reasons.
Thank you very much. Anna, I'd like to move on to you, because I understand that you've been doing some research about institutional culture, or the climate of the campus, which relates to the issue of students' understanding of consent. Perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit about that research.
Yeah, so I'm really excited that in September, along with the University of Portsmouth Students' Union, I'll be publishing a report into research that we've collaborated on, the members of the sociology team and the Students' Union, in particular the welfare officer, Hayley Turner-McIntyre. And we did a survey of 1,300 students at the University of Portsmouth, and we both asked about the prevalence, their experiences of sexual harassment, sexual violence, dating violence and stalking, but also about attitudes, so what's called rape myths. And I think what we found is really important for thinking about prevention. Because we found that firstly, male students were more likely to believe these rape myths than female students, or to indicate that they either agree with them or are not sure what they think. And also, even, I mean, the good news is that the majority of respondents to our survey were very clear that they did not agree with rape myths, but there was a kind of a largish minority who were really unsure, or who did actually agree with these rape myths. And it showed in some cases a worrying lack of understanding of simply the legal state, you know, what constitutes consent under the law. So for example, around 20% were unsure about or agreed with the statement, it can't be rape if both parties are drunk. So people aren't actually clear on the legal definition of consent. Similarly, between a quarter and a third of our respondents either agreed with or were unsure about statements about rape happens when a guy's sex drive goes out of control. So beliefs that male sexuality is something that's out of control and men can't control themselves, which is a common myth across society, which attempts to remove the responsibility from sexual violence from the perpetrator. And actually, you know, that's very disempowering to men to suggest that they can't control themselves. But actually, you know, kind of a large minority of our respondents were unsure about these statements. So I think there's work to be done, but as Nikki was saying, there's a question around if consent classes or discussions are voluntary, you know, then the kind of 3/4 of students, 2/3, 3/4 of students who are really clear that this is not okay and who don't hold these attitudes, you know, might be going along to them. But how do we get to this minority, and, you know, this predominantly male minority of students who are actually unsure about what they think about these statements, and they don't really know what the law is, and they don't really understand how rape myths work. And so I think that's the urgent issue around prevention and around changing attitudes.
And could you tell us a little bit more about these rape myths? Like how many sort of are there particular myths within there that you think are particularly worrying?
So yeah, I mean, this is a kind of an area of research that, you know, academics have been looking into for quite a few decades, and there's various different questionnaires you can use. And the tricky thing about rape myths is they change over time. And so, you know, I've mentioned a couple, which is, you know, men can't control themselves. And that's why sexual violence occurs. Or, you know, when people get drunk, you can blame alcohol. You can't blame the person who carried out the sexual violence. Another common one, which also had, you know, concerningly high responses in our survey, was that women lie about rape. That, you know, oh, that she made it up because she wanted to get revenge on somebody. And so, you know, actually a disturbingly high, still a minority of respondents to our survey, you know, did believe those. And so even if someone holds that attitude, you know, it doesn't mean that they're going to go on and perpetrate sexual violence, but there is a link around the culture and the climate, because actually, if you think that's okay, you're not going to challenge your friends when they say these kinds of things, and you're not going to recognize your own experiences. You're not going to be able to recognize something that's happened to you. So I think what's really tricky is understanding how these rape myths are shifting over time culturally, because there's, you know, a heightened awareness, you know, particularly since Me Too, but, you know, over recent years, thanks to student activists, you know, like Nikki and Josie in large part, for kind of bringing this to the surface, for raising awareness. But the tricky thing is how to do education projects that create a non-judgmental space where people can actually be honest about saying, well, actually, that's genuinely what I thought. And of course, some people are going to believe these myths because this is what society, this is what culture, this is what fiction and TV and films are telling us. So it's, you know, it's a real challenge to think about how to create the spaces that are going to successfully engage young people. And I know the Students' Union and the welfare team, wellbeing team here at Portsmouth have done some great work with, you know, the rugby club and with Students' Union societies. But you know, it's got to be a partnership between students, and, you know, obviously working with Students' Union and students activists is a really good way forward, and making sure that student voices are leading on this, but being appropriately supported by the union and by the university.
And can other universities use your campus climate survey?
So part of the reason we did this research was to see how surveys from the US and elsewhere in the world work in the UK context. So we're very happy to share the survey questions we used, but when our report comes out, we'll also at some point, when I get a minute, produce some recommendations for what changes need to be made. So for example, there are, you know, kind of changes in legal definitions, changes in cultural context, which mean that the survey questions might need to be changed. And also, I should say, there are other academics and activists around the UK who are also working on similar work. So I think hopefully we'll start to see more materials being published, but I have the permission of our Students' Union to share the survey that we used with anyone who wanted. So please drop me an email.
Thank you. So I'll move then to Nikki and Josie, and to ask you about the role of students in universities' efforts to better address harassment and sexual assault. How important do you think it is to include the student voice?
Well, I think that when we're talking about these standards that have to come in, and universities need to be held to that standard, and there needs to be sanctions for it, I think also it needs to come from within, because there's lots of kind of shifting of, well, should it be the government's responsibility to hold universities to that standard, and then they'll turn around and say, well, they're private institutions, and there's a lot of kind of shifting of this. And I think it does need to come from universities themselves realizing the major shift that needs to occur and being open to that. And I think that because reputation is such a big part of this for them, obviously in making these big shifts, things will need to come out about the current situation at their university. But I think an important part of universities taking responsibility and kind of beginning to make those changes from within is understanding the climate at their university, and that and the core of that is listening to students themselves and understanding their experience. So I think it really is a beginning stage of universities taking responsibility, understanding the current situation, to then move forward and see what they can do about it. So I think student voices are really important, and also students are an aspect of putting pressure on those universities to hold to these standards, because at the end of the day, it's their well-being, it's their livelihood, that is their student experience. So kind of they need to make universities aware of their experience, and also because universities will have to face up to that in the long run if students are turning around and saying, you're not supporting my well-being, because prospective students are going to see that, and then that will have an impact on them.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything about the importance of the student voice? I know you've already mentioned it, Anna, with regard to the work that you're doing.
I could add. Again, I agree with what was previously said, and a point which stuck with me just then was what Josie was saying as in the student role of making institutions aware of what the issue is and how it's currently manifesting. But I think there's also a student role to play in solutions, because I think what can be seen as a successful outcome can differ for who's involved. And if universities perhaps see a successful outcome as, okay, we've highlighted and adequately publicized how to go about reporting, we have maybe offered certain services to support the student, and then the outcome is that they've made the report and that's it. okay, that may be as successful as what was possible in that scenario, but isn't necessarily successful overall. I think what's important as well is like how success is framed in these scenarios. There may be like, what is the best possible outcome? But again, when there is more accountability and a good amount of support in place, it should be equal. I know what has been emphasized a lot previously as well was that both the reporter and the person responding are taken into account, but when you get an equal outcome for that, it does sanction the survivor. So when it comes to these things, I think it would be important, and I would hope to see going forward that what's taken into account is how, well, in these scenarios, I do see the survivor as one of the most important individuals involved, and so then that should be the priority, them not being re-traumatized, them not feeling silenced and let down. And then everything else should almost be secondary to that. And I think as from a student or past student perspective, it's not necessarily, like as a campaign, we've also emphasized how it's not about the whole shaming of the university or going for the reputation and whatnot. And I think one of the most respectable outcomes can be that the best attempts were made and important support was put in place. And yeah, I'll finish there. Thanks.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. So that's talking then very much more about a more student-centered approach is what you're sort of suggesting. Would Anna or Georgina like to come back on that and add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to recognise that students are at the bottom of the pyramid in terms of having power or authority within the university, and yet the role of students and the role of universities towards students and its position in society as a sort of gateway for the next generation, the forming of the next generation, means that the student body is hugely important. And one step towards giving them back, redressing some of the power imbalance, is listening to them, giving them a voice. And so it's absolutely essential that their experiences, their needs are heard, because a one-size-fits-all approach to solutions is also not necessarily going to be fair. I mean, different individuals will need different solutions, and so there needs to be some flexibility within the process. And you only know what different solutions are required if you listen to people.
Thank you. So I'm moving now to Anna and to ask, documenting and learning from incidents is critical to improving standards. From your experience, do you see evidence of universities being willing to encourage reporting and better record incidents?
That's a big question. We, from the recommendation and changing the culture 5 years ago that there should be central records of complaints and reports, we're still got a long way to go, which is a bit depressing. There's some good practice. So I know at Durham, they're recording disclosures, asking members of staff who are students disclosed to record that. So they have a sense of whether disclosures are turning into reports or what's happening with those. And we're also seeing good practice in a small number of institutions who are publishing annually the number of formal complaints they've received around sexual misconduct and the outcomes of those reports. So for example, case upheld, if people drop out. Now, this is a no-brainer. The Office of the Independent Adjudicator and the Good Practice Framework suggests that complaints should be annually reported on to the university community. So there should already be an annual complaints report produced. And within this, we'd really like to see sexual misconduct complaints and ideally racial harassment complaints, disability complaints as well, drawn out so that we've got a sense of what we're looking at. And this will allow institutions to say, yes, we're doing well, or yes, we're doing better than last year, or it'll allow activists and students to say, well, hold on, why are none of the formal complaints getting upheld, for example, if that's happening. So, that's an absolute no-brainer. I wish that would happen immediately. In terms of encouraging reporting, there's a lot more that institutions could do. And one of the things that I've found from my interviews with students who have reported is that the process of reporting, or disclosure to university, is quite a long and complex one. So people might actually have made the decision that they want to report, but what I'm suggesting is that they also need a catalyst or a trigger that's going to allow them to actually act on that decision that they've made, or that kind of desire to report. And so universities can actually create these catalysts or triggers. So I found that students are more likely to report at specific points in time. So when they feel safe enough, so that might be when they graduate, if it's a staff member, or at the end of the academic year. There might be an escalation in abuse, that's a trigger to reporting, or there are other kind of triggers that happen. So universities can actually capitalize on this by finding, at those points, making sure that they're publicizing the reporting process, on graduation, at the end of the academic year, and finding other ways to work on that. So I've been writing something about that, which is an article that'll be out in the Journal of Gender-Based Violence quite soon. And actually, that was something very, very clear from my interviewees, that even if they wanted to report, they needed that space to be made by the institution. And so there's some quite practical steps that can be taken towards that. It's about institutions signaling, not just like sitting back, and I know Report and Support does a lot to make the reporting process a lot easier and simpler, but there's even more that can be done around that, around institutions signaling that they, that they take this seriously and that they're ready, and particularly those trigger points in time to encourage students to come forward.
Thank you. And Georgina, can I ask you, what we used to have before when it came to the reporting and recording of incidents is that that universities were reluctant to do that because of reputational damage. And so that's why they were using non-disclosure agreements. Obviously, there's been a lot of publicity around the use of NDAs. And I wonder, have universities, are they doing that less now?
I mean, my insight is anecdotal. Anecdotally, I don't see much difference. And of course, they're not compelled. There's been a lot of talk about NDAs, and Ireland have just put in a bill to try to prohibit, a bill that would prohibit the use of NDAs in sexual misconduct situations, with a few small caveats that would allow it in rare occasions. We don't have that sort of prohibition here, and there have been a lot of consultations about it, and the recommendations have been sort of pretty mealy-mouthed. They're not going to change much. So I think universities haven't taken that on board. I think the misuse or the overuse of confidentiality goes beyond NDAs, because that's where there's an actual agreement. Whereas I think universities misuse confidentiality even when there's no agreement in place, by simply saying to someone, where they come and they report, say, a rape, and they're told, right, okay, keep it confidential, and then we'll investigate. They give the impression that because it's been reported to them and is part of a confidential investigation, the fact of the rape itself is confidential data, and the student, in fact, they've threatened students with disciplinary action if they dare disclose it. And of course, the university has no proprietary right to that information. They've been privileged in having it shared with them so that they can comply with their duty of care to this student and others. They don't have a right, like a trade secret, to tell that student to keep silent about it, but they try to impose confidentiality. They tell the student they have, and so the student believes them and keeps quiet with devastating effect. But I think confidentiality, anyway, plays into coming back to Anna's comment, and there are two forms of recording data, or two uses it can be put to. And I think everyone agrees that it's really good to record this data, because then you can audit what's happened. And if none of the reports of sexual misconduct have been upheld in the last year or the last 5 years, you can start questioning why. And that's really important. But there's also another use of recording data. And that's because when someone complains of sexual misconduct, there's often not much other evidence about it. It's a he said, she said situation. And if you're trying to decide something, even on the balance of probabilities, if you've got one person saying X and another person saying Y, you just can't really decide it. You can't decide that it's more likely than not that the thing occurred. So you just say, well, it's not proven, which is most often the outcome, I find. And if universities could overcome that difficulty, because if someone perpetrates some form of sexual misconduct and they get away with it, they're likely to do it again. And there's some evidence that if it's especially staff on student, that they'll just pick a first-year student every year, and they'll harass that one, maybe assault that one, and then the next year move on to another new, fresher. And if a record is not kept of each time someone makes a complaint about a particular person, then on each occasion a complaint is made, that complainant will fail because they cannot bring more evidence than their own, and so they lose on the balance of probabilities. What you need is some form of recording that will maintain past complaints. So even if they're not taken forward to a formal complaint process, or even if they're taken forward but not found, a record of the complaint can be kept. And that means that if there are an accumulation of complaints about the same perpetrator, the university either of its own accord can start investigating it because it has a duty of care, or when, say, the second or third or fourth person complains, then the investigator can have access to the previous complaints and then investigate it by speaking to those previous complainants to see if they now would like to put evidence in, because they have the comfort of knowing that it won't be immediately thrown out because it's a he said, she said situation. So I think there needs to be in place, beyond records of what's happened, but also records of who have made disclosures, even if they haven't been taken forward formally, kept very carefully, because the data protection laws won't allow it to be accessed sort of willy-nilly. It has to be kept very securely and carefully, so only a few people can access it for particular lawful purposes. And I think that will have the effect of improving the accountability of perpetrators, and it will improve universities' success rates in being able to deal with sexual misconduct.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for all your questions. Before we move on to the questions from our audience, I just wanted to update you on how recent guidance and recommendations are impacting ProtectED. As you know, ProtectED was established to encourage, support and accredit universities that are truly safeguarding the student experience, to improve standards across the HE sector, and as we say, to get good practice into practice. Consequently, the reports we discussed today are incredibly useful for ProtectED. They provide material that we can use to reinforce the requirements in the code of practice. They reveal examples of good practice, and also they may identify new issues and area of practice that we need to consider for future versions. So I'd just like to say, on behalf of ProtectED, thank you to all of you for your efforts to improve matters and moving us closer, perhaps one day, to being beyond sexual misconduct. Andrew, I'm sure you've got some questions from the audience for us.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Okay, so moving on to some questions. I can see that we have a couple in the Q&A box. We have a question from D. Odell Athol, who is Head of Welfare, I think, at University of West of London. And she asks, do you think that individual universities won't go first or advocate the measures in these reports and the guidance that we've discussed because they see it as publicly admitting that they have a problem, or that those sort of things happen there, and they're concerned that this might put off students from attending? And if that's the case, how do we convince university senior management that this isn't the case, and that even the opposite could be argued? So shall I go to Anna first?
That's the million-dollar question. We have seen that universities that have really pushed forward and involved pioneering practice are those where senior leadership really get this issue. So, you know, UCL under Michael Arthur was doing this, and we've seen Durham doing, you know, kind of really doing some pioneering work in this area. So in a sense, you know, there's a broader question about how do you actually educate senior management. And I know, you know, one university where they got Rape Crisis South London in to do training for their senior management team. Now that's what should be happening, because they're not going to understand the issues. They're not going to understand why they need to act in this way until they understand the issues more deeply. Because actually students coming to open day, students applying to university, particularly young women, they're going to be aware of this. Their parents are going to be, well, their mothers are going to be aware of this. So kind of trying to hide what is an obvious issue is a really outdated strategy. So I suppose, yeah, I would start by by getting specialist sexual violence experts, and I like to work with Rape Crisis, but whoever your local violence against women, gender-based violence organization is, and get them to do a briefing for your senior management team. Get senior management on board, and you need somebody who's really going to champion this. Otherwise, it's really hard to push through the changes that need to happen.
Thank you. Do you want to say anything, Josie or Nikki, about this? From your experience as recent graduates?
I think in our experience in campaigning, we've definitely confronted this as a major barrier. So, for example, we've had some members of the student union or the university wanting to work with us, and then it goes further and they're like, oh no, a student group trying to expose us, we don't want to work with them. So it's definitely something we've confronted, and we see as a barrier to progress. I think personally universities need to be shown that if you weigh up the publicity of this is happening here against the publicity of we're doing something about this here, I mean, yeah, like has been said, everyone knows it's an issue. You only have to look at the statistics, but the statistics of universities actually doing something about it are probably, fewer universities are doing that. So in the long run, universities are going to benefit from saying this is happening here and we are doing something about it.
Thank you. Do you want to say anything, Georgina?
Well, just quickly, I mean, the Ofsted report came out quite recently in June, looking into sexual misconduct at schools, and found that it was so prevalent that every organisation has to assume it's happening and just needs to do something about it. And so I think we're way beyond the time when universities can pretend that they don't have any complaints because it's not happening. No one will believe that. So it will look much better for their PR if they're shown to be at the foreground of making change.
Thank you very much. Next question is actually specifically for you, Georgina. It asks, in your experience representing aggrieved students and reviewing cases, what do you think are the key areas of investigation that need to be improved?
Oh, quite simply, the complainant needs to be given the same rights in the process as the person they're complaining about. They need to be given the report, evidence, outcome, the rights to attend the hearing. And I think, just as I explained earlier, that there should be a central record of all disclosures made. I think that will be really important to seeing change on the ground.
Thank you. There's the final question from the audience we have is about, and I think this actually goes back to something you said earlier on, Georgina, about a member of staff who's actually committed misconduct on a student, then being asked to leave the university. What's the responsibility of the new university? Can they reject them on the basis of their prior behaviour, I guess, at their previous institution? I suppose you were suggesting they may not know about it, I think.
Yes, I mean, if there's an NDA, they won't know about it. If they do know about it, I think universities, every organisation, whether the perpetrator is a student or a staff member, universities have a duty to keep their place, their environment safe. And so they really need to conduct a risk assessment, because it's not every case of sexual misconduct is the same as every other case. So you don't necessarily need to blackball everyone because of one finding of sexual misconduct. There are different levels of it, and people also can be rehabilitated. So it's a very tricky process, but I think there's no one size fits all. Each university needs to do a risk assessment and decide. But once they're on notice that someone has sexually harassed someone or assaulted someone in the past, then they have a duty to be very careful about what they do next.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Georgina, and thank you very much. That's all we have time for. Thank you to everyone for attending and for your questions. Thank you so much to Anna, Georgina, Nikki and Josie for sharing your insight and experience with us this afternoon. The video recording of this afternoon's session will be made available shortly on the ProtectED website and also on our YouTube channel. ProtectED Reflections will be taking a summer break in August, as will the ProtectED team, COVID willing. So the next ProtectED Reflections session will be in September. Depending on the COVID situation, we hope to be able to relaunch our real world ProtectED Conversations events program in the new academic year. Full details of upcoming virtual and real world, fingers crossed, ProtectED events will be made available in August on the events pages of our website and through the ProtectED Review newsletter, to which you can subscribe via our website. So all that's left is for me to say thanks again to our panelists and to all of you for joining us. Stay safe, have a lovely summer, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Goodbye.